Welcome to NTD Newsroom. I'm Don Ma. President Trump saying his phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin today was productive. What do we know about the upcoming meeting of the two leaders? The federal government shutdown is now in its 16th day. The Senate failed for the 10th time to pass a short-term funding bill. We have the latest from Capitol Hill. A federal judge has ordered immigration officers in the Chicago area to wear body cameras. The Department of Homeland Security says demonstrators are impeding their enforcement efforts. What is the mood and atmosphere like in Israel since the start of the peace deal brokered by Trump and his team? We get an underground view. Airports across North America are dealing with an apparent cyber attack. Pro-Palestinian messages praising the terror group Hamas were broadcast at airports. Britain publishes evidence tied to a now collapsed Chinese spying case. The documents detail malign Chinese activity, but did not clearly state that China poses a threat to UK national security.
This is NTD Newsroom, live from our global headquarters in New York City.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. President Trump will be meeting next week with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Budapest, Hungary. Trump made the announcement just after his phone call with Putin today. In a post on Truth Social, the president said he had a very productive phone call with the Russian leader. They agreed to send their top-level advisors, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, to also meet next week for peace negotiations. That meeting location is yet to be determined. Here's what the White House said about the phone call.
It was a very good and productive call. It lasted more than 2 hours. There were various issues that were discussed. President Putin congratulated President Trump for solving the conflict in Israel and Gaza and bringing peace back to the Middle East. He also thanked the First Lady for her efforts to bring back children and save children in this brutal conflict. And the president feels like great progress was made on this call. They also agreed to have a high-level senior staff meeting convened as early as next week, which will then be followed by a meeting very likely between President Trump and President Putin as well. They talked about Budapest as being a location for that.
Tomorrow, Trump will be meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House. Trump said he will tell Zelensky about his conversation with Putin. Ukraine has been seeking U.S. Tomahawk long-range missiles lately, and that's likely to be a topic of discussion tomorrow. The White House said Trump still believes it's possible to have Putin and Zelensky meet in person. Trump suggested that Russia could trade with the U.S. once the war is over and believes that recent success in the Middle East will help in negotiations to end the Russia-Ukraine war. Meanwhile, President Trump, in another post on Truth Social, wrote, quote, "If Hamas continues to kill people in Gaza, which was not the deal, we will have no choice but to go in and kill them." President Trump confirms that he's authorized covert CIA operations in Venezuela and says he's also considering U.S. land strikes there. The announcement marks a major step in the administration's fight against drug cartels and puts greater pressure on Venezuela's leader, Nicolas Maduro. Here's the latest.
Speaking from the Oval Office yesterday, President Trump said he had approved covert CIA actions inside Venezuela. The move expands U.S. intelligence and military operations against what Trump calls a narco state run by President Nicolas Maduro.
I authorized for two reasons, really. Number one, they have emptied their prisons into the United States of America. And the other thing are drugs. We have a lot of drugs coming in from Venezuela. And a lot of the Venezuelan drugs come in through the sea, so you get to see that. But we're going to stop them by land also.
Trump says the CIA mission works alongside U.S. military strikes already underway. Since early September, U.S. forces have carried out at least 5 attacks on boats the administration says were involved in drug trafficking. Trump says those strikes have almost totally stopped drug smuggling by sea. And now his administration is looking at possible land operations targeting Venezuelan cartels. Venezuelan officials are calling the CIA authorization a violation of international law and accused Washington of trying to destabilize the country. When asked Wednesday if the CIA was authorized to remove Maduro from power, Trump dismissed the question.
Oh, I don't want to answer a question like that. That's a ridiculous question for me to be given. Not really a ridiculous question, but wouldn't it be a ridiculous question for me to answer?
In Washington, members of Congress from both parties say the president's actions are effectively an act of war without seeking authorization from Congress. Senator Jeanne Shaheen, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said the administration's covert operations slide the U.S. closer to outright conflict with no transparency or guardrails. Meanwhile, the U.S. Coast Guard says it seized about 100,000 pounds of cocaine since August as part of a massive crackdown on drug smuggling in the Eastern Pacific. The Coast Guard says the operation, called Pacific Viper, has already stopped 34 boats and led to 86 arrests of suspected traffickers from Central and South America. Rear Admiral Jeffrey Novak called the results remarkable, saying Coast Guard crews are dismantling narco-terror networks and scouring smuggling routes in the Pacific. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem says Pacific Viper is a crucial weapon in the fight against foreign drug cartels and proof the U.S. is reestablishing maritime dominance.
Earlier, White House Press Secretary Leavitt also answered questions from reporters about the strikes on boats carrying drugs from cartels in waters outside the U.S.
The president's been very clear, and he's been very transparent about these strikes, releasing classified video, unclassifying that video, declassifying it rather for all of you to see, and to let the public and lawmakers know with each of these strikes. And, there should be no surprise for this. The president campaigned on using every lever of power to go after the drug cartels who have been trafficking illicit poison into our country for far too long.
Leavitt said the strikes are proving successful as less boats are arriving to the U.S. shores carrying drugs, and that these strikes will continue. President Trump authorized the CIA to conduct covert operations inside Venezuela. Joining us to discuss is Gerard Filitti, senior counsel at the Lawfare Project and attorney specializing in counterterrorism and international law. So good afternoon, Gerard. So what does it involve here for the CIA to conduct these operations inside Venezuela?
Well, what this involved is a presidential finding that there is a danger, a threat to the national security of the United States that's served by the CIA conducting operations, covert operations within Venezuela. This is something that is within the president's authority under Article 2 of our Constitution. Has been done by many presidents in the past, whether dealing with narco traffickers or intelligence issues. So this is now the assets of the CIA are being set to use upon narco trafficking and the drug trade in Venezuela.
How does this intersect with international law?
Well, international law is a little bit of a gray area when it comes to espionage. It's something that everyone does, but is not explicitly covered by permission from international bodies. It's something that is understood to be within the purview of the United States or any country when acting in legitimate self-defense. And this is the issue. President Trump has identified narco trafficking, has identified these drug cartels as a clear and present danger to the United States, a national security threat, given the devastating impact that they've had. So this gives the United States the ability to use its assets, military and intelligence, to defend itself, which is acceptable under international law.
And Gerard, I would also like to know if things such as this is rare or not. Is this new, or are there historical precedents for the CIA conducting these operations in Venezuela?
There are historical precedents for using the CIA for narco trafficking. It's played a role in the CIA has developed more and more counter-narcotics assets and abilities over the years, starting from South America in the 1990s, going into Panama as well, Central America, and overseas in Africa as well. Drug trafficking has also been linked to terrorism, to Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran-backed factions. So the CIA has gradually developed its expertise in narco trafficking over time. So now is the time to employ it, according to President Trump, in Venezuela.
Do you think it could have any impact on international relations, particularly in the region?
Well, international relations with Venezuela were not good to begin with under President Maduro, who is operating as a dictator there. So that is not likely to change, not likely to be any better for this. But this is also, narco trafficking is an issue that affects other neighboring countries as well. And they're just as happy for the Trump administration and their allies to deal with these issues so that they don't have domestic problems in other Latin American and South American countries from narco trafficking, from drug cartels. So this is not something that's likely to dampen relations with anyone other than Venezuela, but is actually a good thing for the region.
So you're saying relations with Venezuela wasn't good in the first place, but I don't know. Is this a little bit different? Because in your mind, is there a risk for escalation between the U.S. And Venezuela in terms of, possible conflict?
Well, there's always the risk for escalation, and that is the concern. Nicolas Maduro, the leader of Venezuela, is not seen as legitimate by the United States and by many governments. He has refused to seat popularly elected parliamentarians in the last election, so he's essentially operating as a dictator, which makes him very much a pariah among Western nations. Among the few allies that he has are Russia and Communist China. So this is a situation where American intervention, if it's not explicit as a military action against Venezuela, helps to shape the people in the country who are already opposed to Maduro and might lead to a beneficial outcome.
Also, Gerard, do you have any guesses as to perhaps how might Venezuela's regime and its allies respond in light of this?
Well, I think we will hear a lot of outrage. We will hear emotions being put before the United Nations and other international bodies. But I don't expect to see any military action unless, of course, the United States takes military action within the boundaries of Venezuela. Right now, interdictions have taken place in international waters, and there's very little that Venezuela can do to that effect other than purposely attack American interests, which would be the type of escalation that no one really wants. So right now, I don't see Venezuela doing anything more than showing diplomatic outrage, but they will probably exercise their right to defend themselves if they see an incursion by American military.
So you brought up international bodies. I'm wondering, will the UN intervene, likely or unlikely?
It's not likely that the UN will intervene. The United States sits on the Security Council, so we'll have a veto over anything that is put before it. So we will basically hear a lot of rhetoric. We will hear a lot of angry language. But between the United States and its allies, I think that the UK, France, Germany will all align that Maduro is an illegitimate leader and that whatever Venezuela puts forth will not have carrying much weight.
So, Gerard, with the time left here, I want to ask you about another topic. A federal judge, temporarily blocked President Trump's plan to lay off federal employees during this government shutdown. So on this, generally speaking, do courts have the power to completely block the executive branch's layoffs?
Courts do have a power to some extent. We have seen that with another injunction earlier in the Trump administration, where the court instructed the Trump administration to hold off on some of the Doge firings. However, ultimately, as we've seen the Supreme Court do, the courts are deferential to the administration's perspective. So this is likely a temporary stay, and when this is appealed, we're likely to continue seeing the layoffs. At the end of the day, when these positions, when these jobs are not funded and there's no congressional appropriation, then there's no justification, no entitlement to these jobs, which is why President Trump is firing people instead of just suspending them.
But I want to ask you further here. Can a president use a shutdown to permanently remove parts of the government or programs without Congress?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and I think we may very well end up seeing the Supreme Court weigh in on this. I think the way that President Trump is arguing or looking at this situation is if Congress does not actually appropriate money for a program, then that program cannot exist. And if the program or department cannot exist because there's no money for it, then it can't have employees. So I think this is the justification that Trump is using, and I think the courts may very well side with him on this.
Okay, Gerard, maybe I'll just ask you one more question here. Does executive power become stronger or stay the same during shutdowns?
Executive power stays the same in theory, but effectively it depends on which departments are operating into what capacity. We know, for example, that DHS, Homeland Security, and the Defense Department have been funded by a previous bill, so they continue operating pretty much as normal through the shutdown. But otherwise, everyone is feeling the pain of the shutdown, and not much work is getting done until these departments, these people are all funded to come back to work.
Well, all right, Gerard, always great to speak with you. Thank you for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Airports across North America are dealing with an apparent cyber attack. Pro-Palestinian messages praising the terror group Hamas were broadcast at airports in Pennsylvania and British Columbia, Canada earlier this week. Officials told Fox News the first incident happened at Harrisburg International Airport in Pennsylvania Tuesday, where an unauthorized user gained access to the airport's PA system. The hacker identified themselves as Turkish Cyber Islam and played messages saying Free Palestine, along with profanity about President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Similar breaches were reported in Canadian airports, where pro-Hamas slogans appeared on airport screens and over loudspeakers. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy called the hack unacceptable and said federal officials are working with airports to investigate it. In Canada, officials told the Epoch Times they're working with federal law enforcement to ensure there were no impacts on safety and to prevent similar incidents in the future. Israel says it's identified 2 more hostages among the bodies returned from Gaza, part of a deal brokered to end the war between Israel and Hamas terrorists. Families of those freed say their loved ones endured horrific conditions while in captivity.
As we knew, Alon survived in the tunnels with a shrapnel wound in his right eye and a head injury from the shrapnel he sustained. During captivity, he was stitched up carelessly while the shrapnel was still in his body, causing him to suffer from headaches. He talks about how, during captivity, he saw how the people of Israel fought for him.
Israel's army says the bodies of 27-year-old Imbar Heyman and 39-year-old Sergeant Muhammad al-Atarshash were handed over by Hamas last night. Heyman was the last known female hostage still in Gaza after being kidnapped from a music festival on October 7, 2023. President Trump says the U.S. is helping Israel recover the bodies of those still missing. He called it a gruesome process involving remains buried under rubble and in tunnels. While the remaining living hostages have now been released under the U.S. brokered truce, there are concerns over the recovery of hostages who died in captivity. After lab tests, an Israeli official said one of the bodies is not that of a hostage. Continuing in the Middle East, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today commemorated fallen Israeli soldiers. The Israeli leader said Israel will achieve all goals of the Gaza war it set out to accomplish.
Whoever raises their hand on us already knows that they will pay a very heavy price for their aggression. We are determined to complete the victory that will affect our lives for many years.
Netanyahu was speaking at a state ceremony for fallen soldiers during the 2-year war with the Hamas terror group. The Israeli leader paid homage to what he described as the wonderful sons and daughters who gave their lives in battle, calling them the foundation stones of Israel's revival. He acknowledged the diverse groups that fought for Israel, including Jews, Druze, Christians, Muslims, and Bedouins. Nearly 1,000 Israeli soldiers have been killed since the October 7th attack. More than 6,000 others were left wounded. And Israel says preparations are ongoing with Egypt to open the major Rafah border crossing with Gaza for the movement of people. And today, President Trump has warned Hamas of the consequences if it kills more people during the current stage of the peace deal. He wrote on Truth Social, quote, "If Hamas continues to kill people in Gaza, which was not the deal, we'll have no choice but to go in and kill them." Earlier, a video shows 7 men being dragged into a circle, forced to their knees, and then shot from behind. The armed men are wearing headbands like those worn by Hamas. A Hamas source said it took place in Gaza City on Monday, but this has not been independently verified. Joining us to discuss is Matthew Faraci. He's the founder of Gideon 300 and is currently in Jerusalem, Israel. So thank you for joining us today. Can you, first of all, to start off here, can you describe the mood and atmosphere in Israel that you're seeing following the initial acceptance of the peace deal brokered by Trump and his team?
Yeah, so I was actually helping cover this story on the day that President Trump came and visited Israel. And obviously the mood was, everybody was on cloud 9. I drove all over Jerusalem. There were parties in the streets, people dancing, people cheering, people celebrating, because you have to remember that Israel is a very small country. The Jewish nation is a very small nation. We are all family. And so when something happens, it feels like family. The other thing you have to remember is because of that dynamic that I just gave you, everybody knows somebody who was a hostage or who was in Gaza or who, all of these horrific circumstances since October 7th have touched every single person in Israel. So it was collectively felt by everybody in Israel. But I think it's also important to underscore that rather than looking at the event earlier this week as the end of the war, in some sense, it's the beginning of a new phase. And the beginning of that new phase is, now that we have a quote unquote deal, how do we enforce it? Now, the early signs, and I'm sure you're going to want to get into this, but the early signs are that President Trump is taking the enforcement, as you just alluded to, taking the enforcement very seriously. That's part of the concern in Israel, is we have a deal, but how's that deal going to hold together? And that's the sense of wait and see that also lingers in the nation.
So, Matt, I want to get into this point that President Trump just posted on Truth Social. He said, if Hamas continues to kill people in Gaza, we'll have no choice but to go in and kill them. What does go in and kill them mean? Does that mean we're going to see boots on the ground from the U.S.? Can you interpret that for us?
Well, if you look at the president's 20-point plan and you look at the outline of it, according to the latest reports from the president, we are in phase 2. Okay. Now, the issue is that think about the practical reality of what's happening on the ground. Okay. The first day that the IDF pulled out of Gaza, Hamas came up out of the tunnels and started shooting people left and right. In fact, it was happening while the president was speaking at the Knesset. Why did that not happen previously? Because the IDF had Hamas pinned down in the tunnels. And when the IDF withdrew, Hamas wanted to assert their authority over the population and make sure that no other rival clans could step up. They've been doing that ever since, flagrantly just doing that ever since. So again, this is part of the issue. You're dealing with a terrorist group. I think people, because of goings on and funded by Qatar and others in social media, people don't think of Hamas as what it is, a group of thugs, and I think I'm being really charitable by using that term. As far as your question about boots on the ground, my guess, and it's a guess, is at this point, again, because we're entering phase 2, one of the things phase 2 calls for is this kind of interim peace authority. The issue is that this interim peace authority hasn't been set up yet. So who's the only people there at the moment, at least that we know of, is the IDF. So common sense would suggest that what the president is saying is, if Hamas doesn't stop it, he would then ask the IDF to go in there and clean up some of the savagery that's taking place right now.
So in terms of governance, you brought that up just now a little bit. Do you think it's possible for Hamas to not have any role in the future governance of Gaza? What are the difficulties of that, and how likely is it?
Well, here you asked a loaded question, okay? So you're going to get what you deserve. So here's not just Hamas. So you have this larger problem. The Palestinian Authority, the PA, which also has a presence in Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank, is not that much better than Hamas. They're corrupt. One survey that we saw after October 7th showed that 80% of the people in the Palestinian Authority were supportive of Hamas and what Hamas did on October 7th. So what you're talking about is much bigger than Hamas, and that's one of my big questions. Is the plan calls for this technocratic, sort of benign Palestinian government that would rule people fairly and, keep the trains running on time, give traffic tickets, all the things that a civil municipal authority should be doing. And one of the big questions being asked here in Israel is, who is that? Who are those people? Where are they? Where are the so-called moderates? Because if they exist, there's not a lot of people that know who they are. And so when you say Hamas, you're also talking about the Palestinian Authority and other groups that exist both within Gaza and in Judea and Samaria. And it's kind of like when you go to the cereal aisle and you have 47 different brand names, but they're really made by 2 companies. That's, I think, a good analogy.
So in terms of this 20-point plan that Trump came up with, you mentioned there are some concerns with that. How are Israel citizens viewing this plan brokered by the Trump administration?
I think most of the population right now is still in celebrate the hostages are home mode and Thank God we're getting a break from the war mode, because for the last 2 years, people in Israel have been subject to all kinds of things as a result of the war, not the least of which, of course, is the constant missiles being fired, running to shelters, folks being drafted into the army to be in reserve duty. Life has been very disrupted in Israel since October 8th. And so there's a collective sense of relief. At the same time, I would say among the keener observers and of the leaders in Israel, and I'm sure they're talking to the Trump administration on a daily basis, they're now definitely in day after mode, which is, how do we solve this? How do we keep this stable? How do we get the rest of the bodies of the hostages back? And of course, another issue, 2,000 very violent, dangerous people were released from Israeli prisons as part of this hostage deal. One of the people that was released, for example, killed a mother in front of her 6 children. Another was responsible for killing several dozen Israelis on a bus. What do you do about that? So that's why I'm saying there's a euphoria here, and definitely an appreciation for the United States and for the president with what he's done. But there's also a general sense of, this is the Middle East. Now we get into the nitty-gritty details. How do we make this work?
Do you think enforcement is one of the options that could actually make this work, is to make sure that Hamas lives up to what it agrees to?
I think that's the only option. Again, this is a terrorist group that we are dealing with, a terrorist group that is popular, a terrorist group that is absorbing new recruits all the time, a terrorist group that benefits from an ideology that is literally in the water in the areas in which it occupies. In other words, they teach little children this ideology from the time they're young, that this is what they should do. So you're talking about a multi-generational effort here. And at least temporarily, if you think about what the president has done, for example, with the National Guard in Washington, D.C., the only way to get crime down that was rampant was to have very robust enforcement from the National Guard. Same thing here. The only way that that's going to work, and I don't know whose boots on the ground this is going to be, but it's going to have to be some serious boots on the ground, because terrorists are not going to willingly give up on being terrorists. We have heard some rumors that some of the remaining Hamas leadership has moved into southern Syria. Southern Syria is another under the radar hotspot that people haven't been talking about a lot. The regime in Damascus has, we're not sure if it's the regime or people that are aligned with the regime, but definitely ISIS forces have come into southern Syria, and they've been slaughtering Christians and Druze, and they've also been threatening Israel. And there's some concern that the terrorists from Gaza are linking up with the terrorists in southern Syria. So again, there's some real existential issues going on here.
So Matt, I understand you've said that you're concerned about what could happen now in the West Bank. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, well, a lot of these 2,000 terrorists who were released, it would be very natural for them to go into the area of Judea Samaria, also known as the West Bank. And, you know, many people in Israel remember the fact that Sinwar himself was actually released from prison in a similar exchange. And he went on to mastermind the October 7th attacks and run Hamas for a good deal of the war. Therefore, you've got 2,000 other people similarly who have just been released. And there's I talked to a lot of terrorism experts here in Israel. They are very concerned that there will be a sharp increase in violence in Judea and Samaria as a result of these releases. I saw a father and a son on X just in Gaza today saying, hey, we're going to commit another October 7th and my son's going to join me. So again, the mentality has not only not changed, it's even further hardened. And so the only solution, and again, very promising signs from the president here, it looks like the president's saying, I'm not going to give you an inch, so don't try anything. And if you do try something, we're gonna have robust enforcement. That's the only language that people understand in the Middle East, and that's the only option.
Okay, Matt, let me ask you just one last question here. How do you see this conflict ending? Is it through a peace agreement? Is it through the elimination, complete eradication of Hamas, or some other thing?
Well, I think that the core issue here is that none of these terror groups can do what they do without the support of countries like Iran and Qatar and others. And so the key here, long term, and there's an ideological problem which also has to be fixed. So maybe let's call that the long term. The key in the short term here is you have to cut off the financing. You alluded earlier in your broadcast to Free Palestine messages everywhere. Those are on social media, being pushed very hard by the CCP. Remember, the Hamas leadership went to Beijing and received the support of the CCP. And so if you look at the CCP and their allies, and again, Qatar and Iran, etc., they're pushing this propaganda. They're trying to keep this part of the war going. And only when you eliminate that funding in the short term do you have the chance to A, stop the onslaught of very harmful propaganda online, but also to literally defund these terror groups so they can't do what they're doing. If they don't have money, they don't have missiles, they don't have training, they don't have sophisticated weapons. If you look at the Houthis in Yemen, they've been testing, in some cases, weapons provided to them from Iran. So you have to cut off the head of the snake. And at least from the Israel side, that's talked about a lot in Israel, and how that's going to be accomplished is something that's yet to be seen.
Well, all right, Matt, it's been really good to talk to you today. Thank you for giving us your time.
Thanks for your time.
A new report reveals that more than 500 U.S. universities have cooperated with researchers linked to the Chinese military in recent years. Experts warn those partnerships may be helping Beijing advance its defense technology. NTD's Tiffany Meyer has the report.
The study from private intelligence firm Strider Technologies found nearly 2,500 joint publications in 2024 alone. They covered fields like physics, engineering, and computer science. That's down from 2019, when more than 3,500 joint research papers were published. But it's still a major concern for national security officials. Despite government efforts to limit these partnerships, Strider says the practice remains widespread. American institutions have been fueling China's military advancements in areas like anti-jamming communications and hypersonic weapons. A House committee has been sounding the alarm too. It's urging tighter visa screening for Chinese scholars and stronger protections for U.S. research. The DHS warns that the CCP continues to target American universities and companies to steal sensitive technology. The Justice Department says roughly 80% of economic espionage cases in the U.S. have links to China. In response, Congress is moving to limit U.S.-China research. It's introducing a new bill that would block federal funding for projects tied to China's military and putting tougher rules in place for university partnerships.
And for more exclusive China news and in-depth analysis, tune in to China in Focus with Tiffany Meyer at 9 p.m. Eastern, right here on NTD. The FCC yesterday said it's moving to stop a Hong Kong telecom carrier, HKT International, from operating in the United States over national security concerns. The FCC directed HKT to explain why the FCC should not launch revocation proceedings, citing its affiliation with China Unicom Americas. If finalized, it would prevent the company from providing international and domestic telecom services to and within the United States. Washington has taken a series of actions against China's telecom and tech industries in recent years. FCC Chair Brendan Carr said yesterday that the commission is working to ensure that Chinese-controlled entities that pose national security threats cannot connect to our telecom networks. The UK says it's facing an escalating threat from hostile states such as China, Iran, and Russia. The head of Britain's domestic intelligence agency, MI5, issued another warning yesterday, the second one this week.
When it comes to China, the UK needs to defend itself resolutely against threats and seize the opportunities that demonstrably serve our nation.
He added that China is guilty of cyber espionage and luring academics to China. The head of the agency also said China is interfering in UK public life and harassing pro-democracy dissidents in Britain. His statements come just 2 days after MI5 warned that the country's politicians are being targeted by agents from China. Russia and Iran UK lawmakers are being warned of attempts to gain information through phishing attacks, blackmail, and the cultivation of long-term personal relationships. President Donald Trump is involved in plans for a new monument in the nation's capital, a triumphal arch. Trump personally came up with the design to commemorate the country's 250th anniversary next summer, according to a White House official. Small models have been made of the arch, which resembles France's Arch de Triomphe. The monument will be placed in a traffic circle near the Arlington Memorial Bridge, but it's unclear how the project will be funded or when it could be built. The Trump administration is seeking to make in vitro fertilization more accessible. What we can expect from the announcement later today, we bring it to you live.